Hello, welcome to Planes. On the 15th of August 2019, Ural Airlines 178 landed in a cornfield after departure from Moscow's Zhukovsky airport. A flock of birds had been ingested into both engines of this Airbus A321-200. The crew were able to glide, this is arguably a misdescription, and land in a cornfield. Everything happened in 90 seconds. The flight crew were hailed as heroes and given awards by the Russian leader as heroes of the Russian Federation. However, once the investigation took place, the truth was quite shocking. To properly understand, we must tell the true story of what really happened and why this plane ended up in a cornfield. It is also a lesson as to what happens if a pilot refuses to follow procedure and the effect of stress on human behavior. It was a bright early day in Moscow. Ural Airlines 178 was at Zhukovsky International Airport in the outskirts of Moscow, departing to Simferopol International Airport in Crimea. At the time, Ural Airlines was one of the airlines in Russia with the best safety record, as not having any fatal or serious accident since 1993, when it became a spin-off of Aeroflot Airlines. Following pushback, the aircraft started taxiing to runway 12 for departure. The captain and pilot in command was Damir Yusupov, who had about 4,275 hours, with almost all on Airbus A321 family aircraft. His first officer was a less experienced young man by the name of Georgy Muzin, who was 23 years old with 780 accumulated flight hours, and he had been employed by Ural for just under a year. The rest of the crew consisted of 5 flight attendants and 226 passengers. Any passenger rightly assumes that only competent pilots are allowed in the cockpit. The crew had completed the pre-flight checks and including calculating the takeoff speed and a briefing in the event of engine failure. The plan in the event of an engine failure was to retract the landing gear, climb to 400 feet AGL, level off and secure the failed engine. At this point, they would seem to be like a crew with a plan. Only once this was done would they begin working through the ECAM alert messages. The aircraft followed the Follow Me vehicle to the runway, and at 6:11 UTC, the captain instructed the first officer to check in with the tower. First Officer Muzin followed the instructions to contact the tower and requested and received permission to line up and wait. As they entered the runway threshold, both pilots spotted a flock of gulls on the grass verge next to the runway. This was not an uncommon sight at this airport, but curiously, they initially made no particular comment. It had become so common that air traffic controllers had developed a positive habit of warning flight crews about bird activity on every single takeoff. As the aircraft entered the runway, the captain did observe that there were hardly any birds, to which the first officer agreed. Hardly any? Is this the new norm? As they turned onto the runway, Captain Yusupov scanned the strip for any sign of additional birds. He then said, "There are hardly any birds there, no?" However, something then caught the captain's eye as he queries hardly any, and said that, "But some kind of flock is flying there." The first officer acknowledged this and said, well, there's something flying." The captain replied, "No, I mean on the runway." But the first officer disputed this and said, "No, there are hardly any on the runway." Obviously, the pilot did not trust his own eyes, in which case Specsavers or Vision Works or any optician is perhaps what he needed. The captain decided that this was good enough and that's it. And let's go. We are ready for takeoff. This begs the question as to whether the safety of the flight had been properly considered when a captain was prepared to take off when he knew that there were birds on or alongside the runway. But maybe he's a chancer. Maybe he has some way of communicating with birds. The first officer then reported to air traffic control, Sverdlovsky 178 ready for departure. Zhukovsky is the call sign for Ural Airlines. They were cleared for takeoff from runway 12 with a warning of bird activity. The takeoff clearance was read back and the thrust levers moved 2 notches to the flex position, in essence a derated takeoff. The runway at Zhukovsky International Airport is a very lengthy 15,100 feet. Moments after starting the takeoff roll, the captain again spotted birds near the runway. At this stage, he still had the opportunity to abort the takeoff. Instead, he said, "Come on, fly past." Bird, followed by an expletive in Russian. Captain Doolittle in action, a chancer and a person who speaks to bird, a skill that every pilot should have. At that stage, the speed was at 60 knots, way below the calculated takeoff speed of 166 knots, and from the V1 speed. He clearly expected or hoped that the birds would stay out of the way. Is hope or guesswork the best way to make a decision, bearing in mind the safety of the aircraft? Captain Gambler is perhaps a better description. At 100 knots, as per procedure, the first officer called it out and the captain said, "Check." Suddenly, the first officer swore in Russian using the F word. Maybe he spotted the birds again, but he did not say anything, nor did the captain react to it. So let me get this right. Imagine you're driving a car with the missus in the front passenger seat and you start moving off and she swears. You would definitely react. It's like the captain was practicing don't ask and the co-pilot don't tell. At 140 knots, it was still possible to abort the takeoff roll. The first officer then called out V1 and then rotate. Abnormal conditions required a high-speed abort and birds in the path of an aircraft counted as abnormal. I must give a shout out to Bravo 77 Whiskey for most of the footage. He does landing and takeoff videos all over the world and it's fun to watch. I have put a link in the description. Now back to Ural Airlines 178. As the captain pulled back on the stick to climb, disaster struck. The gulls took flight from the grass verge on the left side of the plane and cut across their path. At this stage, there was nothing the crew could do. The gulls slammed into the fuselage, wings, engine, and at least 3 ingested in the left engine and at least 1 in the right engine. As the plane was 2 and 4 feet above the ground, the left engine blades were damaged, leading to a substantial loss of thrust, and the bird had stuck a sensor on the locking door which monitored the engine reverse system. This triggered an immediate ECAM message. So let's remember the plan. Gears up and continue to 400 feet and then ECAM messages. Let's see if this crew followed what was agreed. The first officer called on the captain to climb rather than say the usual positive rate. The captain did not reply with gear up. His focus was on the ECAM messages. Due to the loss of thrust in the left engine, the plane started to yaw to the left. The captain was still hand flying and held the pitch to 12.5 degrees nose up, which is the takeoff pitch angle for an engine out. He then began pushing the rudder pedals to prevent the yaw, which was caused by the loss of thrust in the left engine. He then attempted to engage the autopilot, which would have reduced his workload, but he failed to use the rudder trim system to adjust for the forces caused by the use of the rudder pedals as required by the engine out procedure. Initially, the autopilot engaged. Due to the reduced engine thrust and with the flight directors on, the captain reduced the pitch to assist in gaining speed. The aircraft was airborne at 181 knots up to a maximum of 183 knots, but was losing speed due to the left engine now being just above idle. The anticipation of an engine out was that there would be at least one good engine. There were also engine vibrations. At 300 feet, the captain, contrary to what was agreed, called for ECAM actions, and the first officer began reading the ECAM display messages. Before they could take the first action, the autopilot disengaged. This was because the captain's use of the rudder pedals was such that it exceeded the autopilot disconnect threshold. Now, this is not the first time that we've heard of a pilot being excessively aggressive with the rudder pedals, and this kind of action does not usually end well. The captain immediately retook manual control, and his actions had caused him to lose the benefit of the autopilot and therefore his workload. What both pilots seem not to have realized was that the landing gear was still down, and this caused considerable drag and more stress on the one good engine. At 313 feet, the plane began descending and the ground proximity warning was activated with the call out, "Don't sink, don't sink." The speed was now 164 knots, which was below takeoff speed of 166 knots. A single good engine could continue the climb with the landing gear retracted or down. However, the sensor damage and damaged fan blade meant that the right engine was not given the full required thrust. To put it mildly, the plane did not have enough thrust to maintain altitude. The crew had two options, neither of which they took. The first would have been to raise the landing gear or engage the togger power on their working engine. Instead, with a lack of speed, the captain decided to increase the angle of attack by pitching up, which inevitably meant a loss of speed and possible stall. He completely disregarded the flight directives, which he should not have. This increased pitch reminds me of the tragic Air France 447, which reinforced that pitch when losing altitude can be a death request. He had also stopped applying the rudder to reduce the yaw, which caused more drag. At 290 feet, the captain took action and applied tugger thrust on both engines. The left engine did not respond, but it became apparent that it was damaged as an ECAN message showed that it was overheating. The engine was suffering a compressor stall. Loud bangs and shudder rocked the aircraft as it lost speed and altitude. The captain reduced power on the left dying engine. He then called out autothrottle off and ordered the first officer to watch speed. The first officer did not reply or call out the speed. I don't want to be too harsh on this first officer, but when you decide you're capable of being a pilot and have undergone the training, in this situation, the passengers are entitled to have expectations. The captain then transmitted on the frequency to declare pan 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 pan, and he ordered Murzin to request a return to the airport. At a speed of 152 knots, the captain finally moved the left thrust lever to idle, but this did not help. The first officer called out altitude, and the captain's response was to pitch nose to reach 12.5 degrees, which is the initial climb on a single engine, but the plane's protection system kicked in to prevent it from stalling because of the high angle of attack. Can you guess the next action of the captain? You guessed it, his reaction was to pull the stick even further back to 15.5 degrees. No matter how hard he pulled, the alpha protection system would not let him increase the angle of attack. Had the pilot not been stopped by the aircraft, it would have stalled and plunged to the ground, killing everyone on board. The plane continued to descend with nose high in the air. The autopilot disconnect sound was still on with the surging right engine. Don't sink, terrain ahead, pull up, messages. Fortunately, ahead of them was an empty cornfield. At 120 feet from impact, the captain abruptly retracted the landing gear, pulled the side stick as far back as he could go. At this point, I have to praise the captain for remembering that the landing gear was down, and my question is he flying alone or is there a co-pilot? The landing site was selected, but they did not really have any actual alternative option, and no brace command was issued. Flight 178 crash landed into the field at 142 knots. As soon as the plane landed, the cabin crew opened the doors and deployed the slides. Only 3 people suffered serious injury, including the first officer with a fractured vertebrae. There were issues about the training of these pilots, especially on the issue of bird activity and what they were supposed to do. There are also issues about the steps taken by the airport to disperse birds. The final reports suggest that if every pilot aborted takeoff because of birds, no flight would ever depart from this airport. But in this case, the pilots had seen birds on and near the runway, and it is their action, not only on the ground, but also in the air, that is being judged. The final report concluded that the pilot's failure to follow engineered procedures and in the order required had caused the crash into the cornfield, in particular the failure to raise the landing gear. The pilot should have followed flight directives as the procedure required. The award to the pilots as heroes of the Russian Federation now appears both premature and a mockery of true heroes. The first officer was asked why he did not respond to the emergency as he had been trained, and his telling reply was, "Because real life is nothing like the simulator." The situation required the crew to stick to their training and exercise good judgment amid a series of unexpected and sometimes misleading indications. The sad truth is that not everyone is capable of performing under stress. The report also identified various latent deficiencies in the way airports are operated and overseen in Russia, which may or may not have contributed to the failure to keep the runway free of birds. So do you think that my criticisms of the pilots are justified? Give your views in the comments below. Do also consider liking and subscribing to help grow the channel. Thank you very much for watching and see you next time. Bye bye.